In this section, I want to talk to you quickly about file formats and resolutions and the files you can use in Photoshop. Photoshop pretty much will open up almost any file other than a Corel file. Corel and Adobe don't seem to want to talk to each other, so a Corel file is a CDR file, and if you want to come out of Corel Draw, you would want to come out as a PDF, which is Portable Document Format. That's actually an Adobe format. But Photoshop will open up what's called a PSD. That's a Photoshop document. That's a Photoshop format. It'll open up an EPS, encapsulated PostScript, which again is an Adobe format. It'll open up a JPEG, which stands for Joint Photographic Expert Group, commonly called JPEG, JPEG, but been shortened to JPG, because on the Windows side we can only have 3 characters for what's called the extension on a file. It'll also open up an AI file. An AI is Adobe Illustrator, and of course Adobe Illustrator is an Adobe program. So Photoshop will open up almost any format, including TIFF, which is Tagged Image File Format, commonly called a TIFF, TIF or TIFF. Keeping in mind that some of these formats, PNG, BMP, GIF, any of these type of file formats, TIFF, are all raster formats, pixel-based formats. An EPS file can have vector information, can be vector information, can have a raster information in it, can be a raster file. A PDF, portable document format, which is pretty universal, can have vector information in it. You can take a file right out of Corel Draw that you've built as a vector file, do an export or a save as a PDF, and do the same thing, of course, out of AI, Adobe Illustrator, and open that file up in Photoshop. And even though there were vector elements when you save the file, Photoshop rasterizes those elements. So it will take vector information and rasterize it. So Photoshop will open up a variety of formats. The most common file format is JPEG, and JPEG I say common because it's the masses think that they're computer graphics experts, and so they take pictures on their cell phones now, and they want to send you a cell phone image, or they want to send you something that they've grabbed off the internet, maybe from Google Image, and have you separate it. And those files are typically JPEG. JPEG stands for Joint Photographic Experts Group, and it's actually an algorithm that compresses a file, makes it smaller in size. The problem with JPEG is that as it gets smaller in size and smaller in quality, the JPEG quality, the file quality really suffers. We're going to cover how to fix and improve low quality JPEGs in a separate video. For right now, we're just talking about the various file formats that Adobe will open up. Now, the key thing is the file resolution. I find that a lot of times people will build images on low-res files that they've gotten off the internet. Typically, a file off the internet is 72 dpi. And by the way, you can refer back to your PDF mini manual that came with this part of the course, and it covers all about file resolutions, file types, and things like that in written form that you can refer back to. But basically, the resolution is important, and the physical size is important. They have a kind of a correlation. Good example is a file I have right here that I inherited many years ago. I think I got this file way back during 911. It's actually not very bright. The red isn't very bright. The blue isn't very bright. But this file came to me this way, and remember, I have my rulers open, and notice, even if I extend this a little bit, this file is 2 inches, physically 2 inches wide. Now, I get these kind of files on a regular basis from new customers that want me to do the couple color separations for them, and the question from them usually is, can I use this file? And so this file is a JPEG. It says so right there. Let's check the resolution of this file. If I go to the image pull-down menu and come down to image size, it tells me the physical size of the file, 2 inches, and that it's actually 300 dpi. Now, this file may be 300 dpi, but my guess is this file was at one time lower resolution than that. I get customers that will occasionally say, when I tell them that the file isn't very good, they'll say, well, the file is 300 dpi. Well, you can take any file that is lower resolution and sample it up to a higher resolution. It doesn't make the file really any better. It will soften the file quite a bit, which in some cases is fine. But if we zoom in on this, clicking on the zoom tool, remember that tool? Zoom in, we can see how soft this is. And being a JPEG, these are called JPEG artifacts. Again, we're going to cover how to improve JPEGs in the next video. But the file isn't very sharp. Now, Many times, though, you look at a file like this, and when people say, well, can you separate it? And my response typically is, well, based on the content meaning there's no hard edge type that'll be real ratty looking and jagged if it was low resolution, or physically small, and if I blow it up, it's gonna make it softer. The file itself is going to be, if I separate this, or we separate this, it's going to be Eagle's head on a shirt. And so based on the content, we could probably get away with the file being low res. It is physically small in size. And so when you get the files in, you must know what you're working with. I find that people sometimes just bring a file in and then separate it and have no idea what the size or the resolution is. You need to get the file to the correct physical size you need and the correct resolution, which is 300 dpi. Now, by the way, back to a term I used a few videos ago was vector snob. If you're a vector snob and you don't like jaggies, and maybe you're bringing in a file that you built in a vector program, then work at 400 or 500 dpi. That's okay with me. We all have fast computers, and it won't make a big difference, except that when you zoom in on vector type that's been rasterized, the jaggies will be very, very tiny, and you'll never see them. But typically 300 dpi is where we work at final size. So if we go to the image pull-down menu, come down to image size, I can make this file physically 12 inches, and I'll leave it at 300 dpi, and we're going to do what's called upsampling. Now it's going to soften the file somewhat. Basically, we're saying there's a lot of pixels here, Photoshop, and now let's make this file bigger, and you guess where to put the additional pixels you're going to add to this file. And so we're going to say OK, and it's going to think. Now you're gonna think when it's done that the file's gone. No, it's zoomed in on it basically. And so if I click on my zoom tool and click on fit screen, there's my file. If I zoom in on it now, it's softer than it was before. And we're going to discuss in the next video how to sharpen images and improve images. For right now, we're just discussing file formats and resolutions. So you have to know what it is. The file needs to be at the right physical size and at the right resolution before you start doing separations and doing any work on it. So you've got to make sure you know that. The file must be RGB. If I go to the image pull down menu and come down to mode, it tells me the file is RGB. Now sometimes and by the way, I'm going to click and make this CMYK. You'll see a slight color shift on this. Don't blink. And we'll turn off this little warning. It went a little duller. If you get a CMYK file, that means someone has thought they were doing you a favor, or maybe the file was used for print. And if you get a CMYK file, the file needs to be converted back to RGB. The person that converted it to CMYK, which is ink colors, they lost some information. You know, the RGB color spectrum is like the entire rainbow, basically, and the CMYK spectrum is much smaller. They call this the color gamut. The rainbow is this big. The CMYK, what we can make with only 4 ink colors, is less. But the file must be RGB when you're working on it and separating it. So if you get a file in the CMYK, and you'll know it's CMYK because it says so right here, and if you look at the channels panel, which we haven't covered yet, it says CMYK, you can go to image mode and make the file RGB. Now I mentioned in an earlier video that also when you are checking your file out, sometimes you'll get files from agencies or graphic artists that want to work at the highest res they can. It'll be 8 bits per 16 bits per channel. Some of the Photoshop tools are not available when a file is 16 bits. So you should need to keep your file 8 bits and RGB. So the file needs to be the right correct physical size. Now let me just show you what happens when we upsample. I'm going to close this file out, and we'll bring up one that I've used a lot in various seminars. I'm going to click on the zoom tool. Let's first of all check this file out. This is image size. This file is 72 dpi and physically not very big. And I'm going to zoom in on this, and we'll see how jagged it is. Now this file actually came to me from a customer many, many years ago, and their complaint was that there was not much detail in the faces. And of course I told them, did you use a zoom tool? Those of you that know me know that many times I'll send an email back and say, when you ask me if the file is correct and can be used for separations, I'll come back and say, did you use the zoom tool to zoom in on it? Because this is what I see down here. Now, because this file is only 72 dpi, let's see what happens when I sample this file up. I'm going to go to image size, Let's make this file 300 dpi, and let's make it physically about t-shirt size. And we're going to leave the resample check to automatic. Now later on I'll show you that you can check to nearest neighbor, which makes it a little harder upsample, but it will not make these jaggies softer. These little pixels, it'll make them bigger and very square. We're going to just leave it for automatic. We're going to say OK. It's going to think. And again, you'll think you've lost your file, but it actually just zoomed into the black area. If I go to fit screen, there's my file. Now let's zoom in now and see the difference. Now, it's not jaggy, it's soft, and there's a little more detail, I think, but it's no longer jagged. There's no longer huge pixels by simply upsampling it. If you're going to get files off the internet, you have to make them 300 dpi and the right physical size before you start adding additional elements. I am often amazed at files I get from web graphic designers who will send a full-size t-shirt file that's only 72 dpi. It took me a while to figure out why occasionally I would get files that were built obviously in a vector program, but I inherited them to separate at 72 dpi at final size, and it took me a while to figure out and asking questions why I'm getting files that are 72 dpi, and I realized these are web designers. That's all they think is 72 dpi, and they build the file not realizing that in the t-shirt business and in the print industry, we need much higher resolution files. So sometimes you'll take an image off of Google image and maybe a little background or a piece you figure nobody's ever going to care, and you'll bring it up and you'll start adding type elements to it, and then you rasterize the entire file. Well, all those type elements are now 72 dpi. You've got to upsample your files first to the right resolution, make them the right physical size, and then start piecing together your design if you're building your design, or if you're adding type elements, any kind of vector elements which you can add in Photoshop. It'll be rasterized before you separate it. So make sure you always upsample your files, and you check the size and the resolution of your files. Now, when you open up a file that was built in a vector program like CorelDRAW or Adobe Illustrator that maybe hopefully is built as a PDF file, you get this window in Photoshop. This window is what comes up. This window default resolution is set for 72 dpi with anti-alias checked. And so physically this file is small in size. It's going to be low in resolution when Photoshop opens it, and there's going to be soft edges to the jaggies, which will be very hard to separate. And so this is a typical vector file that was built in a vector program, but if you aren't careful, and people tend to blow by this window when they open the files up. Let's just blow by this window and see what happens. Now it has a transparent background because it was built in a vector program. But look how low res it is. Look how jagged it is. If we go to image size, it's 72 dpi and physically small. Now we can upsample this, but that would be silly because we have screwed this file up by just when we opened the file. Let's open it up again. I'm going to close this file out. We'll open it up one more time. Now we're going to uncheck anti-alias, make the resolution 300 dpi or higher if you're a vector snob. Physical size about t-shirt size, and say OK. And now we zoom in. And now we have sharp edges that are clean. Yes, there's jaggies. They are so small that when you print this on a shirt, put this on a screen mesh, convert this and separate this into a purple, a gray, an underbase, a pink, maybe a darker purple, and separate it. When you have halftone dots, you put the halftone dots or the hard edges onto screen mesh, put it onto a knit shirt. You're never going to see the jaggies. But the difference was how we opened the file. Resolution is extremely important, and you've got to make sure you know the resolution and you don't screw up good vector files. I wrote an article a couple years ago that said it was written to artists. It said, stop screwing up good artwork. And what that means is they build it and it's great, and then they want to send it off to somebody like me to separate, and they screw it up because they send me a Photoshop file where they have done exactly what I just showed you not to do, thinking they were doing me a favor. When the reality was, I'll take the vector file. Let me open the vector file in Photoshop. Let me control the resolution and the final size.